totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey guys, welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Find the podcast online at bookedonrock.com. Every episode there in both audio and video, exclusive video segments from episodes, a blog, the latest rock book releases, and check out the all-new Booked on Rock store. First-time guest to the show, we have Walter Kolosky here to tell us about his new book, Mahavishnu Memories, the remarkable tour history of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra. The author of the acclaimed Power, Passion, and Beauty, the story of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra, Kolosky spent years researching and digging deep behind the scenes to bring us this remarkable tour history of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He tells the remarkable tale with the help of fans, journalists, musicians, and the crew who traveled with the band. You can find a playlist of Mahavishnu Orchestra in this episode's show notes. Thanks for being here, Walter.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having me on board.
Prior to this book, you released Power, Passion, and Beauty, the story of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra. That was August of 2024. It's an in-depth look at the band, but can you give those listening not familiar with the band's history a brief overview? How and where did they form? The first incarnation had a short but very influential run before some lineup changes, right?
Yeah, first I want to go back to a Power, Passion, and Beauty. What I released in 2024 was sort of a print-on-demand version of the book, and it was updated. The original book came out way back in 2006.
Okay.
And it has sold ever since. There's a lot of Mahavishnu fans out there and a lot of fans that are discovering Mahavishnu. And that book, Power, Passion, and Beauty, it's not necessary to purchase that book to enjoy my new book, Mahavishnu Memories, but it wouldn't be a bad idea, because it gives you a lot of background of the band. As far as I'm concerned, I first became aware of the band back in 1973. There was a show on ABC television on Friday nights called In Concert from 11:30 to 1 o'clock, and it was broadcast in stereo over your local stations. What a concept. It's the first time, and you hope that the TV picture matched what you heard out of your radio. It generally did not, but you could record the show and you'd have really good audio. So I was watching the show one night and I was pretty bored, to be honest with you. It wasn't one of the better shows for me. And around 20 minutes to 1 o'clock, this band comes on and my first reaction is, what the hell is this? Because I see a guitar that has two necks and the guy playing it's all dressed in white and he has very short hair. There's a violin player, which I wasn't really used to in rock music at that time. The bass player had a see-through bass. It was just the visual of it was stunning right away, even though I only had a 12-inch black and white TV set. Then, Eric, they started playing, and I didn't understand what I was hearing, but somehow it was attracting me and, in fact, capturing me. You know, later I would learn that they were playing different time signatures at the same time, things you just didn't hear in jazz, actually that you just didn't hear in rock music. And this combination prevented me from sleeping that night. Could not sleep. The next day I woke up, I went to the local record store and I found Birds of Fire, which was Mahavishnu's second album. I didn't even know they had a first album. I would say within a month of listening to that music, I swore off all my rock music. And I decided that I'm going to try to find out more about this music. We now call it jazz rock fusion. It didn't have a name back then yet. Jazz rock fusion is sort of a marketing name. And I learned about Miles Davis this way and John Coltrane, and all the people that had come before that had served as precursors to this type of music. Tony Williams' Lifetime, which was a band that John was in the late 60s, sort of an offshoot of Miles in a way because of the drummer Tony Williams. Eventually, of course, I repurchased all my rock records as CDs many years later when I realized there's no need to get rid of some music just because I like some other music. And a lot of that stuff was great. it's best to be a well-rounded listener. But Mahavishnu, for me, provided sort of a guideline for the type of music that I was going to listen to, at least for the next 10 years, and only listen to that music for the next 10 years.
Full transparency, I have just started listening to this band because of the book. I mean, honestly, I had seen the name Mahavishnu Orchestra over the years and just never listened to them. I just thought, well, it's kind of a funny name, you know, but I've heard so much about them. You know, that's one of the reasons I love doing this show, is to learn about these bands that I really don't know much about. And I had the same reaction as you did in 1973. Like, what am I listening to? I mean, it blew me away. But also, what am I listening to? Whatever it is, I can't stop listening. I pulled, and thanks to Spotify, I was able to sample so much of this. But some of this stuff gets really cool. Like, On the Way Home to Earth, what is McLaughlin doing there? Or is it McLaughlin? I've heard people pronounce it both ways.
Well, there's three questions there, even though you don't know there's three.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm so excited to talk about this band.
Now, first of all, it just warms my heart that the book made you go listen to some music.
So
that's fantastic. And one of the catchphrases that I use is that this is a book for those that saw the Mahavishnu Orchestra live and in person, and for those that wish they had. I'm going to say about 25% of the people that read my books on this type of music are young people, because a lot of them, especially musicians, they test their mettle with this music. Even young pre-teenagers in schools of rock all over the world play Mahavishnu music, which is really bizarre, if you ask me. I forgot the question because I was answering the others, but
well, just to start, it's McLaughlin or McLaughlin? People
that's question number 2. It is both. Yeah, John pronounces his name McLaughlin when he's in the United States because he believes that's how people pronounce it. So if you hear him sometimes at the end of concerts, thank you, and I'm John McLaughlin. Other places around the world, he might say, I'm John McLaughlin.
Got it.
Depends on where he is. I asked him that, and it's an argument that goes on forever because it's pronounced differently at different times. Right. Now, the third question is...
I forgot what the third question was.
On the way... Well, there's a lot to cover. On the way home to Earth.
Oh, now, God, yes. What is he doing there?
Well, I'll tell you what he's doing, but that is the version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra that is not in this book.
Right.
So you have to remember there's 4 different versions, really, of this orchestra. And I cover the first version, 1971 to 1973, which is really what I'd say is the legendary part of the band, because it was the first band. And you've seen the book. It's not a small book. It's 540 pages in a 6x9 book, 135,000 words. I cannot imagine how much time it would have taken me to write about the second version, the third version, and the fourth version. The book would be 2,000 pages. If I remember, he's sort of using some form of ring modulator on that tune, and that tune from that album, Visions of the Emerald Beyond, was sort of a precursor to directions they would take in the next album called Inner Worlds, in which they used more, I don't want to say tricks, but sound effects, and they were pushing their instruments and synthesizers and everything they could as far as you possibly could, sometimes past good taste, to me. I love that album, but can listen to it once a year because some of it offends me. Other parts of it are unbelievable. When people generally talk about the Mahavishnu Orchestra, they're talking about the first version. That said, I think you tend to like, let's say you pick an artist, John McLaughlin, for instance.
Depending on where people are listening, we can do both.
Right. And it also depends on the first time that you hear him. If you heard John McLaughlin in the second Mahavishnu Orchestra first, that would be your favorite version of the orchestra, which seems to me to be pretty reasonable. If you heard him in the guitar trio in 1981, that might be your favorite type of John McLaughlin, and so forth and so on. So I once listed, I said, if you had 5 top fusion bands, the top 2 for me would be Mahavishnu 1 and Mahavishnu 2, and then these other great bands afterwards. That's how I would rate it. But for reasons of space and also this concept of you can only be new once, Eric. You can only be new once, and this applies to everything. And that's why I chose to feature 1971 through 1973 in this book.
Well, let's focus on that. So the early lineup, that first lineup, Billy Cobham on drums, Jan Hammer on keyboard, Jerry Goodman is on electric violin, and then Rick Laird, who I believe is the only member who has passed, right? I think all of the other original...
That's correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. He passed away on July 4th, 3 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. Yeah, he was the bassist, and he is given credit for sort of holding everything together because the band itself, they were traveling to space, if you want to put it in a simple way, and he needed to rein them in, and that was his job on bass, and so he did that. He was actually quite a virtuoso player, but not until the end of their run when things were running down. Did he start displaying that? Generally, he was a timekeeper, kept the bottom for the band. And if you listen to a lot of great bass players, they say he was one of the most underrated players from that time period, simply because he knew what had to be done for that band, and he did it.
I am fascinated with this sound of the band, as you refer to it as being 4D. Where did the idea of the electric violin come to play? What was the inspiration? Was it all John McLaughlin's idea to come up with this sound?
It was his idea to have it in his band, but there'd been electric violin players around and jazz violin players. Now, combining the two of jazz and rock, that was a relatively newish thing. But we had Jean-Luc Ponty out of France who was doing this with Frank Zappa and the Mothers, and Jerry Goodman himself was in a band which, in hindsight now I'd call a jazz rock folk band called The Flock out of Chicago. But John always wanted the violin in this band, and he heard a record from The Flock, and it was Jerry Goodman, and he wanted him to be in the band. And that's how that became a thing.
Billy Cobham was with Miles Davis at one point before?
He recorded with him, as John McLaughlin had, but he was most known at that time for a couple of gigs. One, he was in Horace Silver's band, Horace Silver, a jazz pianist, and then he was in another group called Dreams with the Brecker Brothers and others, and this was sort of, a jazz rock band as well. But John met him through the Miles Davis connection, probably for the recording sessions of Tribute to Jack Johnson, very famous Miles Davis album that really featured John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham going at it. And this is the time they became friends and started jamming, just the two of them, sort of laying the foundation for what would become the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
There's some blues in there, some hard rock, I suppose you could
Eric,
say. There's a little bit of everything in there. That's why I'm wondering where these guys came from, and maybe is it just a melting pot of sounds, of influences, of the bands that they played in beforehand?
Well, I think it's both. And it's truly an international band. Billy, basically from Panama, at least family was from Panama. Jan Hammer from Czechoslovakia, Rick Laird from England, Jerry Goodman, U.S., John McLaughlin from England as well. So you sort of had this pan global band together.
Laird from Ireland?
Yes.
Right.
Rick Laird from Ireland. And so this got combined with really New York City. The scene was really happening there in New York City. And that's where these guys all connected. Jan Hammer had played in jammed with Jimi Hendrix himself. So he was around it from Berkeley. Rick Laird had been at Berkeley. And so when they all met in New York, there's an album ahead of time called My Goal Is Beyond that John did, and Jerry Goodman and Billy Cobham are on that. And that's when John first played with Jerry. He had played with Rick, but had never played with Jan. And so, lots of times I think back to my youth, and we used to have garage bands. And generally what a garage band was, a whole bunch of friends got together and formed a band. They ended up breaking up and hating each other at the end. That's basically a garage band, With Mahavishnu, it was sort of the opposite. You got a whole bunch of players together that didn't really know each other. And then, this stew created the combination that became this music. They all added to it in the jazz tradition. Now, people will argue that this was a rock band, and they're right. And I would argue it's a jazz band, and I'm right too. And that's what set it apart, was the improvisation, which sort of became a little bit of a problem a couple of years later, because the band was making a lot of money. They were successful, and jazz bands generally didn't experience that. So when that started happening, who do you credit the compositions to when everybody's improvising on a melody that was provided by John McLaughlin? So, some unrest with a couple of the members, and, that sort of spelled the end of the first version. But even Jan Hammer said, even when when they were having difficulties, on stage, they had a great band, and for the most part, there was one or two exceptions, for the most part, any troubles weren't heard on stage. They had a good band, and Jan said, we may as well use it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Mahavishnu Orchestra, for those who aren't familiar with the band, just learning about them, I'm sure they're wondering, they're probably saying, Eric, ask the question, what is behind that? I think John came up with that, right? John McLaughlin?
Yeah, actually his guru, Sri Chinmoy, did it. And the term itself roughly means creator and preserver. That's what it means, but Mahavishnu in a whole, it means everything. It's one of those vague things, but creator and preserver is the definition I tend to use. Now, the band is considered a spiritual band, and this wasn't so unusual. You have to remember at the time the Beatles and other musicians were seeking out gurus and whatnot. But not all the members were into this, and a lot of fans assumed they were, and this could cause some problems. But if you listen to the band thinking about spirituality, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about spirituality, which I think is a different thing, you can hear that in the music. There's no doubt. It soars. It has great drama to it. It's serene at times. And my feeling was, even if some of the members that were in the band didn't think it was spiritual, that they were playing spiritual music, they were, at least to my ears and to many other ears. The album covers themselves would have an aphorism, a poem, by Sri Chinmoy on the back of them. And so it made everything seem, as I said before, very spiritual. But not everybody was in it for that. But, some of the music, even on the later versions of Mahavishnu, I mean, you could envision that being played in a temple, a church, a mosque, because that's where it took you. It took you to some other plane. Of the band, both Rick and John were the most spiritual of the bunch.
So let's get to the book. Covers the live history of that original lineup, 71 to 73. And you say in the introduction that this band would put you through a physical and emotional ringer if you saw them live. What did you mean by that?
You've read the book, which is great, and you've read some people say that they would, after the concert, they'd be sweating. They would walk out of the place silently because there wasn't as much energy as was being put out by the band, and there was a wave of it. Just imagine a hurricane coming out at you, but through sound. It could be very punishing to listen to. Sometimes punishment is pleasurable. I don't want to go off into other areas, but you experience this with the band. And, I've written so much about John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra over the years, and this type of music in particular. But what I realized was I never wrote in detail about what they were most famous for, and that was the live performance. What was it like to see Mahavishnu live? because that really, you hear it from musicians, you hear it from people that worked with them, you hear it from fans in this book, especially the first year or so when they were still a surprise. So they would open for some band, and it's as if the headliner shouldn't even come out, afterwards, because what else is there to listen to, as Carlos Santana explains in the book, that, Mahavishnu played and everyone left, even though they weren't the headline band. Now, John has always said that was not his intention, but it just sort of happened. But all these musicians, one of the ways I can put it, we're talking about this spirituality and this higher meaning, they were in your face, Eric. I mean, first of all, they were terribly loud. And a couple of the members would regret that later with hearing issues, right? They were loud. And all the old fogies that talked about rock music being too loud, they were correct. But Herbie Hancock said one time he went to go see Tony Williams, also in Tony Williams' lifetime, also a very loud band. And he knew it wasn't good for his hearing, but he stayed anyway. And you were so drawn into this music, and it was new music that you were hearing, that these live performances, they could either draw you in or they could scare the shit out of you. and people literally ran out of theaters, they ran out of venues. Jan Hammer has said to me that they used to laugh, when this would happen. Now, this book, I talk about every single concert. And when you do a book like this, the most difficult thing is to try to take a different approach to 250 some odd concerts. That's very difficult to do. I did my best. But you have situations where bands that are opening for them or following them have either felt like they wanted to fall into a crack in the world, or they said, boy, these guys are great, we need to up our game. I'll give you an example of that would be Yes, prog rock group Yes. One of their favorite bands was the Mahavishnu Orchestra. They appeared on a few bills with them, and they would watch them rehearse and play and say, we got to get better. Return to Forever, a very famous jazz fusion band led by Chick Corea, felt the same way. He and Stanley Clarke would see a Mahavishnu concert and say, this is the direction that we have to go into. But imagine back, Eric, in the days, and I don't know how well versed you are in jazz heroes, and Oscar Peterson. Are you familiar with Oscar Peterson at all?
That name I don't know. I mean, I know okay. I know the big ones. I know the big ones. Yeah.
So he's a great, big, famous jazz piano player, but of the old school. He would appear on the same bill as the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Imagine that. So when the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and there's a story in the book about this, they hit their first note, and people ran out of the place. Because it was so loud, they had no concept of what was happening, because they were there for Oscar Peterson, who is, one of the world's greatest piano players. In that same bill, by the way, just to give you an idea how eclectic things were back then, was the Steve Miller Band. So it's Oscar Peterson, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and the Steve Miller Band, all on the same bill. Unheard of today. But people were a little more open to music back then. Even the ones that ran away, they just hung out outside and came back in. Those that still had their hearing, they came back in to see Oscar or Steve Miller.
That might be what, because you said only Mahavishnu could only exist in its time. Is that what you meant?
Well, that's right. Its time included beyond just what we were hearing on stage. It had to do with the Vietnam War. It had to do with energy crisis. It had to do with colleges. Unrest at colleges. It had to do with electronics entering music. I mean, a few years before that, Bob Dylan had turned electric, and that was controversial. And believe me, this was controversial in jazz music as well. Do you have to be so loud? I know one of the critics talked about how the band had Indian influences, but he didn't really hear the Indian influence, and he said the only thing that this music has in common with India is that maybe they can hear it there. That's how loud the band was. Later on, by the way, I heard some louder bands that were louder than Mahavishnu, believe it or not. But they would go into some venues, which I talk about, and there would be people inside that were afraid pieces of the ceiling were going to fall down, or the movie screen that was in the place was going to fall down because it was so loud. But that's not the only thing. The other thing is the Indian influences we talked about, the rock music, the polyrhythms, the exploration going on, in that I've heard, let's say we can pick a tune, Meeting of the Spirits, which was off the Inner Mounting Flame, the first Mahavishnu album. I've heard 100, 150 different versions of that tune. They're all different. And this is because of the jazz element, or the sound of the hall, or somebody has an extended solo that night that they normally don't have. So, a 7-minute song on the record, it can be 20 minutes in concert.
Yeah, I do get a bit of a jam band feel to some of these, especially the live stuff.
That's right. So I would say the jam band gets a bit of Mahavishnu feel,
right,
because they followed so many years later.
Right, exactly.
But a lot of these bands and that we hear today, the jam banders and whatnot, they are influenced by this type of music, even if they don't know it. Now, one of the remarkable things about Mahavishnu is that there are so many tribute bands, Eric. And I assure you, there aren't nearly as many tribute bands for any other jazz rock band or fusion band or jazz band, or few rock bands for that matter. And all you have to do is go on YouTube and you will see 20, 30, 40, 50 different bands playing Mahavishnu music, as I said at the beginning, to test their mettle. And Mahavishnu tested themselves. And to a certain degree, maybe toward the end, you sort of get a sense of burning out, perhaps, because you can only push yourself so far. And this particular band, of course, was exhausted, as I go over in the book, exhausted because they just had too many concerts. They didn't have enough breaks. Elliot Sears, who was their road manager, called it one long 2.5-year tour. That is not the way it was supposed to happen. Rock bands back then would play for 3 months, take 6 months off to record an album, get rest, then go back out on the road. They never did that. And when they were learning new pieces, they did it at sound check. Their manager just believed they needed to get out. Eric, I do need to mention a couple other things about the book that I'm very happy with. First, the foreword is written by the great musician Gary Husband, who is a Mahavishnu fanatic, but I'm going to call him a scholar about Mahavishnu music and John McLaughlin music in general. And he wrote the foreword to the book. And I'm very honored that Colin Harper, who is a well-known European journalist, music journalist across several genres, but has written about Mahavishnu a lot. He's very, he has a lot of knowledge in this area. And he was involved in the editing. In fact, is the master editor of the book. So I'm very happy that they're involved in this book as well.
And you've gotten some great reviews. Steve Rosen, Sid Smith for Prague Magazine said some great things about it. Famed jazz critic Brett, I believe it's pronounced Primack.
Primack, right.
Walter should be proud of this work. This is an excellent book and an excellent read and very important documentation. I'm glad he did it. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Come out wherever you are.
The very first show is interesting. You talk about interesting artists that Mahavishnu played with. I just interviewed John Lee Hooker Jr. So we were going back and forth, and I said, John Lee, I'm just reading a book on Mahavishnu Orchestra, and your dad was I think he was the headliner.
Yeah.
New York City, July 21st, 1971. A couple college students recorded some or most of the show with a portable cassette recorder. Both shared their experience from that night in the book. They knew they were watching something special. The band's transformation happens right during that first show.
Yeah, they were a little ragged to begin with. I mean, they just got together. John says by the second set, they were humming. And I think I used the phrase, and they never looked back or something of that nature. They went into overdrive, and never shifted back after that time, because that's really, John McLaughlin really puts a lot of emphasis on live performance. And every time you perform live, whether it's in front of one person, 50 or 50,000, it is a performance. And the way that band looked at rehearsal, it was a concert. And so they pushed each other, even in rehearsal. And this was really a major part of that band. Now, sometimes, I mean, I'm a fanatic, so I would put on a Mahavishnu album, and I'll say, I am only going to listen to Rick Laird this entire album, this listen. And you learn things that you never noticed before when you do that. And you sort of get all the elements together. When I've listened to hundreds of recordings, some of the recordings, mostly from soundboards and whatnot, and some of them are defective, and so you don't hear one of the instruments as much. But this allows you to hear the others more, and you say, wow, I never realized that Rick was playing, for instance, chords on this tune. And other times, because I've contacted people that were there, you hear these concert tapes and you say, something's going on here. What the heck is going on here? This isn't normal, this section. And I'll talk to Elliot, and he says, well, that's because when John went to go look for his acoustic guitar, we forgot to put it out there. And so the band is vamping while they try to get the guitar, which they never got out there. But that vamping section is interesting to listen to. And now you can go, I think that concert is on YouTube. You can go and listen. You say, oh, that's what was going on here. Or you hear some technical difficulties. And so I tried to find out what was going on at the time. A lot of this has to do with the rigors of the road and being a musician at the time. I also interview a lot of people, road crew people that work with the band, people that did light shows for them. What was it like to be part of this? And lots of fans. And that's the thing that I want people to understand. This is why I call the book Mahavishnu Memories. And you've read the recollections of kids that just had their life changed. Some kids, maybe not all kids, some adults too. They had their life changed by this concert. And what's great by these concerts, and what's great is to read what became of those people. A lot of them became artists, well-known artists. They became artists, musicians, teachers, all sorts of things across the board. And that's really my favorite part of the book, is through the ears and eyes of those people that were at those shows, they give you the flavor of what it was like. Some people saw McLaughlin as a god, which I don't think is that healthy, but they did. Some people saw it as a guru. And some people, of course, they had their favorite person in the band. A lot of people loved Billy Cobham or Jerry Goodman. And they'll argue that those were the people that made the band really. But you had three main purveyors of the melody in this band. You had Jan Hammer, Jerry Goodman, and John McLaughlin, and they all pushed the boundaries of their instruments, every one of them. And of course, Billy Cobham did as a drummer too. These guys were instrumental in changing the way people looked at those instruments.
That's where I want to go next. Jock McLean was the band's manager, engineer, personal assistant, tour accountant. I mean, he was a jack of all trades for the band. And the tensions that develop within the band members as far as getting the spotlight on stage, I mean, how much of that was true? Because he says right from the start, the biggest challenge in those early gigs was that they were all trying to outperform each other. How were they able to handle that?
Yeah, Jock was never the manager, but he definitely was the sound engineer at the beginning and the road crew chief at the very beginning. Well, they had to get their act together after a while. As it became more popular, they had to hire more road crew, and Elliot Sears became the sound engineer. But to be honest, especially as an opening band back in those early days, you didn't have much say on what the audio was going out into the hall. It was mostly for the lead bands, and in fact, I talk about the Kinks in there, they were always screwing with everybody else and making sure their sound was good and making sure allegedly that the sound from the other bands was crap. Those are some of the battles you had to face. The key was trying to get the best sound that you could. When they became more popular, Dinky Dawson came in with this great sound system that the band could now afford, and he was doing the shows along with Elliot, and you got a much more balanced sound. It doesn't mean you didn't run into problems, because you would go into huge auditoriums and the sound would just be bouncing off the walls. It would be so muddy. The way I describe that type of stuff, or the way I think about that, and the way I also described a part when they had a couple of probably their worst concerts when they weren't getting along, even when the sound is bad, even when one of the players is off, even when they're not speaking to each other, listening to the turmoil is interesting. I like listening to the struggle of a jazz player. When you see John McLaughlin or hear him playing, lots of times critics will say, geez, he's, it's dissonant. It's out there, he doesn't have the sound under control. They don't understand Mahavishnu, Eric. Okay, because Mahavishnu was really about battling with your limitations. And so John is such a skilled player, and they all were, and all are, that are still with us, that they would try to push against those limitations every night. And sometimes it's a hit, sometimes it's a miss. Most of the times it was a hit. But when you have players like that, you have many high moments during a show, and hopefully during each tune, they reach, an apex, like this tune can't go any further. I once read somebody talked about the intensity of Mahavishnu, about how bands generally, they start slow and they reach a certain intensity. And he described Mahavishnu as starting at the intensity and then going from there. Wow. And I think that's a pretty good description.
Again, going back to the jam band thing, I wonder how much of a fan guys like Jerry Garcia were, and I think Jerry was on a bill with them in the book. You mentioned that, but that's similar to the jam band thing of on any given night, something could happen, some magic could happen, but on any given night, it may just fall flat.
Yeah, a lot too, Eric, depends upon the listener. There's a two-way communication going on here between the player and the listener. And you could be in a group of 5,000 people, but that musician, the communication is just going to one person at a time. And every person is hearing it slightly differently. So I'm honored, and I'm honored to hear that, to hear a person struggle, or maybe they're not struggling, they're so facile that they can play anything and they play it casually, but it touches your heart some way, or your mind. And I'm honored during those nights, and it can happen anytime, any night, any place. There are these very special moments that become ingrained in your brain. We have quite a few people in there in this book, and I didn't use this for all of their stories, but that told me that they saw Mahavishnu Orchestra, and in a way, it sort of ruined them a bit because they've never found anything as good again. It's like you're on a search for the perfect pizza slice that you had in Greenwich Village in 1981, which I still am. Right? Yeah. It's a version of that, or the best Chinese food you ever had. You want to match that in your life, in this music. And ironically, as virtuoso as these players were, after Mahavishnu, they were better players. Naturally, they had to be better players. They were more experienced. But it was that combination, as you had mentioned earlier, at that time and in that place and in the place listeners were, that made all the difference in the world for the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Now might be a dandy time for that recess.
Did they have a whole set list planned out? Or did they just decide, let's start with this song, let's start with these few songs?
They did have it planned out. And every once in a while, they'd change it up. In the early days, not at the earliest days, but in the early days when they started going on tour, Meeting the Spirits almost always opened up.
Right, with the gong?
No.
Is that the one that with the gong? Or which is the song that starts
Well,
with
the gong was used for Birds of Fire.
Right.
However, as the band proceeded, sometimes Billy would use it for Meeting of the Spirits. Not at the beginning, but as the band, because even that gong sort of set a mood for the crowd, and so maybe that gong was used for the opening piece. The opening piece would be just a couple different pieces, really, be Birds of Fire or Meeting of the Spirits, as a general rule. When I found that didn't take place, I note that in the book. So you don't have to be a Mahavishnu fanatic to enjoy this book, but there's tons of stuff in there if you're a fanatic. They would care about what you just asked. Is the gong played on any other song? Maybe somebody else wouldn't. But, I found out that they didn't always have the moment of silence, which they used to open up every show with. And I found this out from Elliot. I just thought that was the thing from the beginning. But it was not. It was one of Jerry's friends passed away. And the concert after that, John had the moment of silence and then decided to continue that way through the rest of the life of the band, even though it would be interrupted many times by cat calls because many people's drugs were just hitting in. You know, they had timed it. They had timed it from McLaughlin and Mahavishnu's set, so it was hard to keep them quiet. And of course, on mixed bills, not everybody was there to see Mahavishnu, so sometimes, you know, they might start to whistle or scream out and stuff like that. There's one story where John, I think this was at Yale, and he just really got upset because they weren't giving him any moment of silence at all. You know, nothing. A minute goes by, 2 minutes go by, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes go by, and they're still having their moment of silence because the crowd won't shut up. And
I had that as one of my questions. That's in the book.
Yeah, and he was gonna make them. And this night he decided, I'm gonna make him wait, because some nights they might scream out, but they'll play. But this night he's gonna make him wait. And I cannot remember the name of the person who narrated the story for me there, but he said, and then there was a split second of silence, just a split second, and then they went into it. And he said the rush that went through the crowd when that happened was just amazing.
Let's talk about when the band breaks, really, is with a specific tour. You write in the book, quote, prior to mega mergers and before the digital age came and swallowed everything, there were still visionaries who believed in the artist and the art. Great music, if promoted the right way, could be heard, and lots of tickets and record albums could be sold. One of those visionaries was Bruce Lundvall. So tell us who Bruce is and how is he able to help promote the band and break the band with a tour with Blue Oyster Cult opening for the Byrds.
Well, he was a record executive. And the idea that he came up with, which sounds like such common sense to us now, is you promote different types of music in different types of ways. Believe it or not, they didn't do that before. If you saw an ad for records, the opera stars and the jazz stars and the rock and rollers, they'd all be advertised the same way. There was no distinction between the genres. Bruce Lundvall said, hey, listen to this rock music, in this case jazz rock music. And he said, there has to be a better way to promote this band. They're not going to get any radio airtime because the tunes are way too long. There are no vocals and whatnot. Let's put them together with some other bands that he wanted to push and put them out on college tours. So you have the first big college tour of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and they're on a triple bill in 1971 with Blue Oyster Cult and the Byrds. The Byrds were the headliners, of course, and they were the big band and they were the draw. And that's what, at the beginning, people were paying attention to. You know, most people were there for the Byrds still, but toward the end of that tour, some of the people that had seen Mahavishnu earlier in the tour, they came and started showing up. So they became bigger and bigger part of the crowd. Blue Oyster Cult is one of the bands who, I used to call them the poor man's Black Sabbath. I always enjoyed Blue Oyster Cult, still do, the early stuff, the rough stuff. I quote some of the guys in the book. I mean, they were, I don't want to say embarrassed. They weren't embarrassed, but they felt like nothing with Mahavishnu there. They didn't feel as good. Again, they had the same idea as others. They used Mahavishnu's appearance, and they could see how dedicated they were, because you had to work a lot to play that type of music. And they became a better band and a much bigger and famous band as years went on. But some writers were following Mahavishnu early on this tour, and as each night progressed, Mahavishnu was getting more and more accepted. Eventually, a lot of record executives showed up to see one of the shows and said, everybody's digging this music. We don't understand it in many cases. And some of them claim they did when they didn't, but, you know, they wanted to be with it. And so they put Mahavishnu out with a combination of all sorts of different people on these college tours. And that's one of the things about the early 1970s. It was happening in the 60s too. And through most of the 70s was the college concert scene. colleges had entertainment budgets and things of that nature, so they could bring big bands in many cases. So the Allman Brothers would play with Mahavishnu at a college. The Eagles would play at a college with Mahavishnu. Taj Mahal, and some jazz players. Some places would be jazz players in Mahavishnu. And of course, the most famous tour that Mahavishnu was probably on was with Frank Zappa and the Mothers, which was late April and early May of 1973. It's sad in a way because this college market disappeared years ago. Back then, concerts existed to sell records. It's totally opposite now. And back then, you could go see Mahavishnu Orchestra for $2, $3.
I wrote down here, I noted some of the interesting acts that they played with. You mentioned some of them. Jerry Garcia, T-Rex, Allman Brothers Band you mentioned, maybe Billy Joel?
I think there's one. No, there's two shows. One's a maybe, the other's definite.
Okay. Billy Preston, Harry Chapin, The Doors, The Eagles. You mentioned Aerosmith, The Pointer Sisters, Frank Zappa, comedian George Carlin. There was another comedian, I think, that they opened for that you mentioned.
Martin Mull.
Martin Mull.
Let's talk about the two comedians. Jay Leno used to open for rock shows. Again, it wasn't an unusual thing. But what was unusual to me, just think about George Carlin. He was very famous. He opened for Mahavishnu. That gives you an indication of how popular Mahavishnu was becoming. And that was only in the band's second year. On that same bill was Todd Rundgren, who had, a big hit song at the time. The Martin Mull, he came out. You can't be more different than Martin Mull when you walk out in your Mahavishnu Orchestra. And Martin Mull does his, I don't know if you're familiar with his comedy back then, but he would set up sort of his living room on the stage, and he'd have a little guitar out there, and he'd tell stories and play. Perhaps, though, the most famous concert that involved comedians was when they did open for Cheech and Chong. I could only imagine. You go to see Cheech and Chong, and the opening act is the Mahavishnu Orchestra. This is a very famous concert. When a whole bunch of Cheech and Chong fans saw that this band was coming out to play, they decided, what need? I don't want to watch them. I'm going to leave, probably go get high, get ready for Cheech and Chong. They left, planning to come back. So they left. Mahavishnu played for about 2 hours, which was much longer than they were probably scheduled to play. And there was some criticism from one of the critics, but when you get behind the scenes, they played that long because they had to. There was something going on and Cheech and Chong weren't ready or whatever the situation may be. You come to your own conclusion. I came to mine in the book. But they played for about 2 hours. So it was finally time for Cheech and Chong. So all the people came back, and all the people who came back into the theater looked, and all the people that had stayed for Mahavishnu, they were all sitting in their chairs like this.
Stunned.
They were stunned. They were dazed. They didn't know what hit them. And you couldn't communicate with them. And there's stories like that throughout the book where the concert's over and I've talked about how they leave quietly. Sometimes people don't even leave their chairs. Their friends had to go back and say, come here. And the great Dennis Chambers once said he saw Mahavishnu Orchestra when he was 14 years old. I said, what did it feel like? And he said, it felt like I stuck my finger in a light socket. That's how he describes seeing Mahavishnu live.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Don't go away, gentlemen. We may need all of you.
The T-Rex story in the book, February 18th of 72 at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. The T-Rex audience were lost at first, according to one review, but once they caught on to the band, after a while, they didn't want them to leave, and then some of them even booed T-Rex. I mean, what was the overall scope of responses from audiences to the band in those early days with all those different types of, we mentioned a lot of the Aerosmith and Pointer Sisters. I mean,
it's funny. I mean, there's a lot of elements discussed in the book. One of the elements is geography.
That was another question I was going to ask you. Yeah, certain parts of the country that they
depended on where you were.
Yeah.
Mahavishnu music in the South was not accepted as well as the bands, say Marshall Tucker, that were on the same bill. So let's say Marshall Tucker and Mahavishnu on the same bill. They're north of the Mason-Dixon line, and Mahavishnu is a tremendous hit. They go a little south, and they're all there to see Marshall Tucker.
Yeah.
I mean, it really depended upon where they were at. Now, sometimes they were misplaced. They'd be at some big festival, say down in Florida, again down south, where they were met with relatively disinterest, because they were there to see the Allman Brothers or Tin Lizzy or whoever the heck was playing, these heavy metal bands that they had scheduled along with them, and they were ignored. That happens, but they weren't ignored by the musicians. Even in those type of shows, you hear all sorts of stories about the other musicians going up there and watching them or watching them from the side. There's a story in a book about Rod Argent noticing the Mahavishnu Orchestra, watching them. And there's another nice, interesting mix. Argent, hold your head up high, and Mahavishnu on the same bill. So that happened down, Billy Cobham was taking pictures of the drum, and the drummer got all nervous because he thought, Billy Cobham, this great drummer, I can't compete with him or compare to him, even though they were playing different music. But even though that was a different genre, Rod Argent calls Mahavishnu Orchestra the greatest band that they ever played with. They were on the same thing.
But yeah, West Coast audiences, were they more open-minded, like San Fran or places like that, right?
Yeah, that's true. They never played Mississippi or Louisiana. You wouldn't play those places.
Played a lot of Connecticut shows, I noticed.
Yeah, well,
I'm in Connecticut. You lived in Connecticut for a while, so those venues I'm very familiar with. Some are still around, like Wesleyan in Middletown.
Yeah,
still there.
Well, they did a lot of shows. They did a lot of shows up and down the East Coast.
Bushnell in Hartford, yeah.
Yeah, Bushnell and
Bushnell was funny. What was the one? Because they were so unknown at the time. They played at the Bushnell in Hartford, July of '72, billed as Mahavishnu Orchestra. So Mahavish space NU Orchestra, and then there's a New Hampshire newspaper. They said would be directed by John McLaughlin. So they actually thought it was an orchestra.
They thought it was a real orchestra, yeah. Yeah, apparently back then you didn't need to know how to spell to do ad copy. That's all I can. I mean, Mahavishnu, I mean, you see everything. And in fact, I was going to include a whole section of just misspellings, because I said, but, the book could only be so long. And in fact, the book is 2 pounds. In hindsight, I wish it was less than 2 pounds because it creates a shipping problem, a cost.
Sure.
Because it has to be shipped as if it's 3 pounds. That's the way the post office works. But I was going to include all of those. There's a couple. There's one from up in Detroit that's an all-time classic. Is Aerosmith.
Yeah.
And Mahavishnu. And I mean, every band is spelled wrong.
Right. ARROW Smith.
Right, and you just say, boy, how did they do this?
Yeah.
How did they get people there? Now, sometimes because Mahavishnu played, they took their manager, Nat Weiss, took every opportunity to find a gig. Even when they were big, they'd take lesser gigs. Even back a few bands up that they were way more famous then, but just to get the extra money on the way to the next place. So when this type of stuff would happen, sometimes you'd have this huge band and they'd be playing a small place. Or more times than not, there'd be no advertising. There's a show in Pittsburgh, or outside of Pittsburgh, that literally, with the exception of maybe some radio ads and at the last minute, and a poster in a local music store, there are no ads. And you wonder, how did people find out? It was just word of mouth. All of a sudden 1,000 people show up or 2,000 people show up.
Wow, yeah, man. No internet.
Yeah, but sometimes, I'm going to say even a year in, they might show up and there's a gig at Vanderbilt University, and the best I could tell, about 50 people were there. And, this was a band that was attracting thousands at the time. But as I said earlier, they'd play their heart out. There's another story about John McLaughlin, who years later, there was some type of snafu. He had another band called One Truth Band, and they were playing a big venue, I want to say in New Jersey, I can't remember the name of the place, and they had 2 shows. But there was some snafu in the advertising and whatnot. So they played a sold-out first show, and they came out for the second show, not a set, an actual show, another concert. And there were like 20, 25 people there, instead of thousands. And they just played the whole show. They're getting paid. We have a good band, why not use it type of feeling. I've always believed this to be true. Great musicians are greater than you think they are. And if you get to know some and spend some time around them, you realize the dedication and how great they are. They're greater than you know. And oftentimes, you can go to a concert, and I've had the great opportunity to go backstage many, many times after a great concert and see a band that cannot be consoled. They think they did so poorly when they were great, but they know how great they can be, and so they're bothered by it. You know, an average musician doesn't give a shit if they're not up to par. A great musician, and a great artist for that matter, across, you know, all forms of art, it matters to them.
Sure.
That's what sets them apart.
I'm sure you've heard the Buddy Rich tapes on the bus.
Yes.
Talk about perfection.
Well,
yeah.
Of course, Rick Laird played with Buddy Rich.
He did play with him. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Buddy fired him 4 or 5 times.
Oh, my God. Yeah, he's ripping into his band for not being absolutely perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
That said, he was a great drummer. He's a great musician.
Hell yeah.
There's this theory, a friend of mine, I don't use his name because I don't want him to have to defend it all the time. He said all great artists, and this applies to, you know, any type of art, whether it's writing or music or painting, anything. God, if there's a God or human or a being or something that gives you powers in this life, if there were 10 elements, he claims if there is 10 elements that forms a total human being, the greatest artists have 9. They don't have 10. They're always missing something because what was going to be used for that missing element is used in the art part of their life, in that. So you might find a great musician, I won't name him, but he's in the book, who is amazing, like an amazing musician, but does not understand money. It has no clue of budgeting or anything else. And that's the weakness that musician has, because it's been taken away or never given to him. That's why a lot of, you know, sometimes you meet these geniuses, but they're a little off. You know, because the gift doesn't go in these 10 elements. It could be 5 elements. It could be 20 elements, whatever that number is. They're lacking in some of those elements to form the complete human being.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, observation.
Well, how do you separate How do you separate Miles Davis from his behavior, or some other musicians, or some artists that were not nice people, painters that were not nice people? How do you separate it? I do. That's my take. I separate it. That's what I've determined to do. I haven't had to make many decisions because, you know, that's few in number generally, but I have to do it. I have to separate the art from the person. Now, when the person is fantastic, that is great. That's icing on top of the cake. But you have to separate the two.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
It's intermission time.
Talk about those Japan shows. This was a challenge for you. There were shows in Japan in '73. It's the most difficult for you to research. Talk about that challenge, and how are you still able to put together this part of the book, because you couldn't skip over it, so you had to.
Yeah, I mean,
why was it so difficult too? I guess I'm curious.
As you know, I went to many libraries and also visited them in a digital way and contacted librarians and archivists all over the world, fans. Not much available in the Japanese press reviews of that nature of this time, even though the concerts were very popular. They sold out, and in the Budokan, it's 14,000 people. Now, finally, a Japanese music journalist, Yumi Kudo, she did find a book that had something about one of the shows in there, and so I was able to use that. But it's very complicated, that last tour that they had. Well, I won't say last tour, but the last foreign tour that they had, and that they were breaking up because of an article that appeared in a music magazine. There was unrest in the band, and they couldn't. There's a lot involved here. For those people, they should read my book, Power, Passion, and Beauty, that want to find out everything about the breakup and everything. This book doesn't go into all that. This is just concerts, live events. But John read the article on the plane, and he was mad. And people weren't speaking when they got to Japan. And they had a press conference right away, and you see all these pictures. I think I have a picture in the book of this. They really weren't speaking. And Elliot Sears, the sound engineer and the road manager, and some of the other roadies were afraid of what was going to happen in Japan. And sure enough, at least the first show, by their standards, was not good. Again, I enjoyed it because I'm listening to the turmoil. I know what's going on, what was going on behind the scenes. And I said, boy, this is fascinating. You know, Rick's generally 2-minute solo is 11 minutes. You know, I mean, because, you know, something's going on. But Elliot says by the time the tour ended, they were firing back again on all cylinders. They were great for the last show. But the archives were just not there. I contacted the promoters. They never contacted me back. And so I had to do as much research as I could from Elliot. I did find references. I did find some images. And it was a tough tour to chronicle, but I think, you know, I did the best I could in that particular sense.
One of those shows, I believe, is the one Carlos Santana points out, the solo on the piece I Wonder, as being his personal favorite. That was in Japan.
Yeah, sometimes you're surprised by the knowledge of musicians. Carlos Santana is one of them. I would also call him a John McLaughlin scholar or a Mahavishnu Orchestra scholar, and he followed the band around. He, you know, years before the rest of us had access to all these tapes, he was collecting all these bootlegs of Mahavishnu, and he can point out solos. And of course, that solo took place in that Japan tour when things weren't going well. That solo was John McLaughlin's solo that he talked about, and he said he could feel John's discomfort in that solo. And that's something I understand, and you understand it more if you listen to more. You know, if you listen to more music and you understand what type of mood is the band in tonight. People would be mistaken to think that funny things didn't happen in the music. Funny things happen in jazz all the time, even if it's inside, just to the musicians. And sometimes, you know, there's a little lick that's played and you go, oh, that's interesting, you know, because you know where that lick comes from and you know that must have made another player chuckle, you know, things of that nature. The title of Power, Passion, Beauty was the greatest band that ever was. The subtitle on this book, I said, and I got some pushback on that, obviously, because it's my opinion. So this book, I changed the subtitle a little bit. I said the greatest live band that ever was, because I think there can be less argument with me, especially since you can go back and listen to a lot of it.
They did come back from Japan and played a few more shows before that lineup ended. October 7th, 73, they played the Colden Auditorium at Queens College in Flushing, New York. That was the first show after the decision to end things. Geraldo Rivera, the MC, at one late 1973 show. We go back to Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut, December 8th, 1973 at Fairfield University's University Gym. And then their very last show, it's an interesting piece of trivia, right? Detroit, Michigan was the very last show from that lineup. The Masonic Temple Auditorium, December 30th, 1973. No signs that the band wasn't getting along, certainly not on stage. They played a great show, right?
They did. They played a great show, great ovation. John wished everybody a Happy New Year. And as I end my book, and then when they went backstage, they went their separate ways, never to be in the same room ever again.
And John formed different incarnations of Mahavishnu Orchestra?
Yeah. At the beginning, I think a lot of it, he had a vision that he did see it as an orchestra after the first version of the band. And so he formed a larger band with Narda Michael Walden and Jean-Luc Ponty and Ralph Armstrong and Gail Moran, Bobby Knapp, Steve Kindler, I mean, on and on and on. It was a big, you know, it was a bigger band. Marshall Westbrook, I'm going to forget somebody. Phil Hershey, sorry if I forgot anybody. And that was a bigger band. But then the economy of scale didn't work, and he had to break it down to a quartet. He had to, well, first he had to cull that band a little bit. Then he culled it even further. So at the very beginning, we talked about Inner Worlds a little bit. And that was the last version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
There was one that was produced by George Martin?
Yeah, he produced Apocalypse, which was the first album of the second version. It's interesting what you end up listening to. Now, I've probably heard Birds of Fire, meaning the tune, or meaning the spirits. I've probably heard both of them over 1,000 times, I would have to say. there's just the regular recording itself, not any live versions. But when I go for pleasure, when I go to put records on, I listen to Apocalypse now from the second version a lot. It's very symphonic, obviously, with the London Symphony Orchestra and George Martin as the producer. And I also listen to the live album Between Nothingness and Eternity. Of the first three albums, to me, it's sort of the weakest album because of sound issues. But for whatever reason, and maybe it's my affinity, I enjoy live recordings above studio recordings, especially with jazz players. There's something about that. I can put myself in the audience. And when I do that, it brings me great pleasure. And so it's interesting what you listen to. You find things. I was in the photography business for many years. I used to take a lot of pictures. I used to be into photography until I went into the photography business. You're dealing with pictures and photography all the time. So in your spare time, instead of taking hikes, taking pictures, you no longer do that, Yeah. And I think it's the same when you write about music, and this is going to sound strange to people, you listen to less music. It's this dichotomy. I mean, I would love, while I'm writing these books, to just have the music on all the time and you listen to that, but it's hard to write that way if you're really trying to concentrate, because the music can sort of lure you away, at least for me. But just like with cameras and using them less when I worked in the camera industry, when I'm writing, I hear less music. One of the things I'm looking forward to after the promotion for this book is over is I'm going to start listening to some more music.
Well, they have Yale University show from October of 73 available now, and then the Berklee College show from November 72. I've listened to both of those. Those are amazing shows. Yeah, any standout shows? Like, there's a one that you say, yeah, that's their best?
There's many shows. There's many. Generally accepted is that show from Cleveland, which is sometimes called Wild Strings. It's a live show from Cleveland.
Is that an official release or bootleg?
Bootleg, but it's on YouTube. It's been there for 10, 15 years. And the announcer, are you ready for some good music? He goes out, here's the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Nobody knew really who they were. They came out and blew everybody away. Now, from a standpoint of legendary, it's widely considered that a tune from the Mar y Sol Festival, which was a disaster festival in Puerto Rico, and only one tune from that performance was ever released. Also a live, it was a live version of the Noonwood Race. And it's considered sort of the single greatest live tune by many Mahavishnu fans that they ever did. Hard to find, but it's around in some places. Now, I did a lot of research, and I write about that in the book and about that festival in depth. And I invite people to read the book to sort of learn the whole story, because it's many pages long.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
I mean, there's no way that we can just pause for a minute. You guys just go home and do your stuff, and then tomorrow we can just continue.
Mahavishnu Memories, the remarkable tour history of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra. It's out now. Find it wherever books are sold. The ebook currently available at Amazon. The premium print version for true Mahavishnu fans and collectors is available at Amazon only in the continental U.S. at this time. The print-on-demand version, printed digitally, worldwide, Amazon, and then the premium print version book can be purchased from you directly.
Yeah, if people have special requests, they can contact me at mahavishnumemories@gmail.com, and we'll see what we can do. The premium print book features high-resolution pictures. It's printed the old-fashioned way on an offset press. The reason I decided to offer that is if you're really a true Mahavishnu fan and you're into collectibles, that's the book you're going to want to have. I'd also recommend, it's self-serving, but if you're a real big Mahavishnu fan that way, I would recommend you buy that book and the print-on-demand. The print-on-demand book, it's fine. It's perfectly good. Same exact book. The pictures are not high-res, however. But those are available all over the world because they can be printed where people are. But that copy, if you buy the premium print version, you want to just go into the book every day. You can go into the print-on-demand while your other collectible item stays pristine up on your shelf. And so that's why I decided to do that.
I believe there are photos that you sent me that are in the book.
I think most of them are, yeah.
So we'll share those with those who are.
There's over 200 pictures in that book of Mahavishnu, and I would say 3/4 of them have never been seen before.
Yeah, great photos. And so people can watch this interview on YouTube to see some of those photos. I'll put those up, and make sure you go out and get this book. I got to get the first book now. I got to read up on the full history of that early lineup. But again, thank you for introducing me to this band. I mean, what took me so long, I guess, is what I was asking myself. Like, why was I waiting? Because I love music in general. Like, why was I not?
Tell you how happy I am that you discovered the band, because that's the goal, not only of this book, but if any time, I meet somebody and they never heard of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and I go,
do you ever plan on doing books on the other versions of the band? I mean, it's a big undertaking, I know.
I'm Mahavishnu'd out.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, it took me 5 years to write this book.
Wow.
I was interrupted a few times by life. This is what happens.
Yep.
Initially, it was going to take a year, 2 years at the most, but it took 5 years. But if somebody wants to use my book as a stepping off point to go to the next band, please feel free. I just can't. I just can't. I've told a couple of other interviewers, I really enjoy research, but at a certain point when I was digging into research, I discovered that I was the source 8 years previous. So I'd be tracking something down. I'd say, "Oh, I wrote this."
This looks familiar.
Right. I go, "Wow, what a great writer this guy is." I go,
that's me.
That's me in 2009. And I just spent, 3 hours tracking this down.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing about researching for books, in my opinion. And I will continue to research on other things, just for my own entertainment. But it's the love of the hunt. When you get in there and you discover new things that I never knew, and I'm considered an expert in Mahavishnu before this book came out, humbly said. But I learned new things, and I learned something new just the other day. One of the things that is happening, and I'll make this my last point in this great interview that I've really enjoyed. One of the things that's happened, and I ask people to do this, if you know more information, send it to my website, walterkolosky.com. Send it to me there, or if you know other ways to contact me, fine. And I already found the name of one of the opening bands that I could not find. So that'll be the second printing. And because somebody was there, I tracked the person down, and sure enough, got it all confirmed. I have to confirm everything. And so in the next edition, that person's name will be in the book. So all on this enjoyable hunt, and I'm very happy with what I was able to bring home with this book.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Walter Kolosky. This was a pleasure to have you on and talk about this amazing band.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I really did.
That's it. It's in the books.